Good morning. It's September 12th. This is To My Liberal Friends. Well, this past week, Justice Amy Coney Barrett was interviewed several times. She did this to promote her new book, Listening to the Law. One of the people she sat down was CBS reporter Norah. And if you watched the interview, you quickly realized this was not going to be a puff piece by CBS, but rather a chance to shoot arrows at Justice Barrett in an attempt to force her to defend both her decisions on the court and the overall tenor of the court. From the outset, it appeared that O'Donnell took this interview as an opportunity to discredit the Supreme Court because she has disagreed with the decisions made by this particular court. This was not a surprise to anyone because O'Donnell is an ardent liberal, portraying herself as a straight-shooting journalist. She's anything but. After claiming Trump appointed her to, quote, cement a conservative legal revolution, end quote, O'Donnell asked Barrett if she is, quote, concerned about the narrative of the court, that it is no longer a separate and co-equal branch of government. End quote. The question, of course, isn't really a question at all. It's a Democratic accusation intentionally couched in the form of a question to give the impression that O'Donnell's dishonest framing of the issue is undeniably true, even though it isn't. The CBS Hope probed Barrett on the reputation of the Supreme Court and asked if it matters to you and how the Supreme Court makes sure that it appears it works in an apolitical manner. The suggestion, as it seems, is that the court is damaging its credibility in the eyes of the public by ruling on cases in ways Democrats like O'Donnell find unfavorable. One of the more deceptive examples of this scheme came later in the discussion when O'Donnell asked Barrett if the Supreme Court risked undermining its credibility by regularly siding with Trump in cases that came before the court's emergency docket. A situation O'Donnell, no surprise, declined to mention stems from leftist lawfare against the administration. Quoting O'Donnell, do these repeated emergency or shadow docket interventions by the Supreme Court risk undermining public trust, especially if they are perceived to be politically motivated and favorable to President Trump? End quote. Now, you think they would ask that if they were giving decisions favorable to a Democrat from liberal justices? Over and over, O'Donnell reverted to the tired tactic of the media by citing unnamed experts or scholars to support the questions she was throwing at Justice Barrett. Why not name these experts or scholars? At one point, she demanded that Barrett respond to observers who claim Trump is pushing the boundaries of executive power and may be overreaching, and that the Supreme Court is not providing an adequate check on that power. As example, when O'Donnell asked Justice Barrett why the court won't permit lower courts' overreaching injunctions against Trump to remain in place until the merits can be heard by the court, Barrett carefully responded by saying, quote, we have to answer these interim questions when they come. I think you're assuming that in a lot of these questions, the president is likely to lose on the merits. But remember, all of these judgments, these are legal questions that we have to make our best judgments about. And these cases necessarily reflect our view, tentative though it is at the time, that the president is likely to succeed on the merits, end quote. Not what O'Donnell wanted to hear. Norah O'Donnell then showed her true colors and lack of knowledge when she struggled to remember how many amendments there were to the Constitution. Barrett countered back by suggesting that O'Donnell had incorrectly framed the questions in an attempt to back the justice into a corner. Barrett's response was classic, and I quote her, I think the biggest misconception about the Supreme Court, and I think it's kind of underlies some of the questions that you've raised, which come from outside the court, is that the court is just a partisan institution. I can understand why people think that, especially because justices come after a nomination by the president and confirmation from the Senate. But that's not how the court functions, end quote. That is the correct answer. When Justice Barrett should have turned the tables on O'Donnell and asked her why so many Democrat-appointed judges at the lower level were attempting to issue these nationwide injunctions, something they were never intended to be doing. These lower federal judges are acting as it's their job to resist the Trump administration's agenda rather than follow the Supreme Court precedent. They overtly express disagreement with the court. They use clever tactics to evade the high court's directions. Sometimes they employ a hyper-narrow construction of the court's rulings. Other times, they make dubious factual determinations, knowing that appellate courts will give them deference. The subterfuge creates a serious challenge to the justices, since they don't have the capacity to review every misapplication of their precedent. And I think anyone who's been watching what I refer to as forum shopping has come to realize that liberal plaintiffs seek to get their case in front of what they hope will be sympathetic judges. In an emergency ruling last week, Justice Gorsuch, joined by Justice Kavanaugh, admonished these lower courts not to defy the Supreme Court. In that opinion, Gorsuch noted that one district court judge tried to compel the administration's compliance with an order that the Supreme Court had already stayed, and another district judge ignored a Supreme Court decision even though the case at hand did not differ in any pertinent respect from one the court had already decided. These are things that Justice Barrett could have parried back at Ms. Donald, but she refrained. The CBS reporter was solely interested in trying to make her points and embarrass Justice Barrett, and the justice was not having any of it. And we wonder why so many in the public have lost faith in the media. When a liberal justice was interviewed, it turned entirely into a puff piece. CBS, you can do better, and you should. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.